Here's a question to think about. Should you start by saving the world or saving yourself? The answer to that question holds a lot more than meets the eye, and that's why this incredible yet heated exchange between Jordan Peterson and an audience member on Australia's Q&A gives us the most vital takedown of creeping collectivism in our everyday lives. Though I have to say this cramped few-minute segment hardly did justice to how profound this debate really is. So let me dive deeper into it after you watch this next clip.
I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because I just don't, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal politely. So, I would consider that more of an opinionated personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
What is your... So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the economic crisis,
out of your control as you think.
What is your answer to
Do you think that you're worse off than
you
think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think that...
Jordan, once again, we're not going to cross-examine our questioners. So try answering the question about collective responsibility on climate change, for example. Pick one part of that, because the argument, I think, is that individual responsibility does not change the climate, does not fix the problem that needs global collective responsibility. So I think that's the core of the question. Do you have a theory about that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways.
That's precisely what modern student activism has become that's coming out of our universities in droves. But you know what's interesting? On something like the climate change front, or the so-called climate catastrophe, as this questioner just put it, I have a hard time thinking of any supposed collective responsibility that isn't just an assemblage of individual actions. What would collective action even look like? Protesting in the streets and chanting slogans with placards, or does it look like giving up single-use plastic or deciding to use public transport to help lower your carbon footprint? How many of these 18 to 25-year-old student activists are willing to make those sacrifices instead of feeling glib and content as part of the crowd? Very few indeed, and I think that's precisely where our universities have gone wrong. They've taken away from students their individual responsibility and left them stranded in the middle on the way to some notion of collective responsibility, and now they're stuck, incapable of making any large-scale social impact and unwilling to make the small changes in their individual lives. They know they should. It's certainly interesting how this kind of warped notion of responsibility has been exported all the way to Australia as well. Jordan's call on people to clean their room isn't a banal statement for the sake of it, but the most important starting point of change. Because here's the truth. The circle of responsibility starts from within you and only then does it start to expand to your house, family, community, country, and the world. But that smallest circle of your life is often riddled with immediate problems you don't want to face, relationships you don't want to fix, and rooms you don't want to clean. Prematurely overstepping into much larger circles of the responsibility then becomes the easiest way to avoid looking that uncomfortable truth in the eyes, while a false and pseudo-moralistic stance on larger scale global problems becomes a way to alleviate the guilt that comes with it. There's something I remember Jordan Peterson saying that has stuck with me ever since, that to paraphrase, the greatest thing about viewing responsibility through the individual lens is that there's another side of the coin for it, which is individual rights or individual guilt. What happens when you saddle a collective with responsibility? Do they then deserve some special collective rights? And if something goes wrong, do they have collective guilt for it? Anyone that understands history knows how truly catastrophic that idea is, apart from being a slippery slope to tribalism and collectivism in general.
If a young person believes that the climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it, do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
Okay.
I don't. Okay. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. That's what it looks like.
And here's something that too many people miss. Any practical notion of collective responsibility that you conjure up still abandons the more immediate actions that you need to take on an individual level. If you're someone like Greta Thunberg that apparently had some sort of climate epiphany at the age of 15, there's a whole arc of maturity and development that you've missed in order to do that. That's exactly what happened, by the way, because Greta had to drop out of school to lecture world leaders on global climate change. In that sense, activism has become a profession of its own, denuded of its real meaning as something you graduate to over time when you've gained the wisdom and experience for it. Instead, the unguided rage over complex global problems ends in throwing soup over paintings or blocking roads to obstruct vital traffic in major cities. And all of that happens with a feeling of glee at supposedly having drawn attention to the cause, while their own lives call out for their attention. The thing about collective responsibility is that there's truly no such thing. Humans are not a collective. At best, we're a bunch of individuals that can chip in toward a larger shared goal, which is not the same as having collective responsibility. In that sense, the first step in either case is to do one small thing in your own life, which adds up if thousands or millions of people do the same. That's actually the same with tackling the environment as well, because it's been shown that poor people around the world start caring about climate change and the environment if they can get the nation to get its GDP per capita up to $5,000 per year. That's what creates a wave of individuals in a bottom-up manner that ends up doing more real work toward bettering the environment than any supposed notion of collective responsibility. I think the conversation you just watched is a bleak reminder of the state of modern activism and how those ideas have seeped into the common populace as well. I don't fault this questioner for taking this kind of activism at face value, because that's what most of our people are brought up in from a young age. What's needed now is to correct course and start changing the world and our lives from the inside out. The thing that you have most control over is also what you have most responsibility for, and there's nothing more proximal to you than yourself and your own life. That's actually what most people understood until a few decades ago, and seems to have forgotten now. Perhaps Jordan Peterson's voice in a world like this is a reminder of what we need to go back to.